It was a bright afternoon, and the golden sunlight poured through the big glass windows of the restaurant, making everything inside glow softly. The restaurant was already full of people, businessmen in suits, families enjoying lunch, and couples talking quietly over cups of coffee. The sound of clinking plates, the smell of freshly baked bread, and the soft background music created a warm, lively atmosphere. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed happy to be, but behind that beauty, the staff was working under pressure. Mark, one of the waiters, moved quickly between tables with a tray in his hand. He was in his early 30s, tall, sharp-looking, and always tried to act confident in front of others. But deep inside, he often looked down on people who didn't seem rich or well-dressed. He believed good service should only be given to those who looked like they could afford it. Today, like every other busy day, he wanted to finish his shift smoothly and impress his manager by serving high-paying customers. The restaurant manager, Mr. Lewis, stood near the counter, checking every little detail, from the shine of the cutlery to the politeness of his staff. He was strict but fair. He didn't like drama in his restaurant. Everything had to be perfect, especially during lunch hour when the restaurant made the most money. He called out to Mark, "Make sure table 7 gets their order quickly. They're important guests." Mark nodded and rushed away, balancing a tray full of drinks. At the same time, the kitchen was alive with noise. Chefs shouted out orders, pans sizzled, and the aroma of grilled steak filled the air. Waiters rushed in and out, carrying plates and shouting, "Coming through," so they wouldn't bump into each other. It was chaos, the kind of organized chaos that only a busy restaurant understands. Everyone was doing something, moving fast, smiling for customers, but sweating behind those smiles. Near the door, a few customers waited to be seated. The hostess smiled and welcomed each one, trying to keep her calm even though the waiting list was long. Outside, a few people peered through the glass, wondering if they could get a table without a reservation. Inside, some customers were laughing loudly, enjoying their food, while others took pictures for social media. It was a perfect afternoon for business, and the restaurant was shining in every way. Mark looked around proudly. He felt good about working in such a popular place. To him, every customer was a chance to earn tips, but only from the right kind of customer. When a man in a designer suit called him over, Mark smiled quickly and hurried to serve him. He made sure the man got the best wine and even gave him extra attention, hoping for a generous tip later. That's how you treat good customers, he thought to himself, but what Mark didn't know was that something unexpected was about to happen that day, something that would change the way he saw people, forever. As he passed by the entrance, the restaurant door opened and a man stepped inside quietly. He was tall, with a calm expression and kind eyes. He wasn't wearing fancy clothes, just a simple shirt and jeans. His shoes were dusty, and his hands looked a little rough, like someone who worked hard for a living. He looked around the restaurant with a gentle smile, almost as if he was proud of the place. The hostess was busy with another guest, so the man waited patiently near the door. No one seemed to notice him at first. When Mark finally saw him, his smile faded a little. He scanned the man from head to toe and quickly decided that he probably couldn't afford to eat there. Mark thought, "He looks like he walked in by mistake." The man, whose name was David, continued waiting politely. He didn't seem upset or nervous. He was just observing everything around him, the decor, the staff, the customers. There was something calm and confident in the way he stood, but Mark couldn't see it. All he saw was someone who didn't fit the kind of people the restaurant usually served. "Can I help you?" Mark asked with a fake polite smile. His tone was professional, but his eyes told a different story. "Yes," David replied softly. "I'd like a table for one, please." Mark hesitated, pretending to check the seating chart, even though he knew there were still empty tables. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "We're fully booked for lunch today. Maybe you can try a smaller cafe down the street?" David didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, still smiling. There was no anger in his face, just quiet understanding. He thanked Mark and turned his eyes toward the dining area one last time. Then he walked out as silently as he came in. Mark shrugged and went back to serving another table. He didn't even think about it again. To him, it was just another customer turned away. He felt he had done the right thing, saving the restaurant from what he believed would be a waste of time. But a few other employees had seen what happened. One of them, a new waiter named Sarah, whispered to her coworker, That man seemed really kind. I don't think he deserved that. The coworker nodded quietly but didn't want to get involved. No one knew who David really was, and no one imagined that by the end of the day, the truth would turn everything upside down. The restaurant buzzed on, unaware that beneath the sound of laughter, dishes, and music, a lesson in humility and respect had just begun to unfold, one that would soon shock everyone inside those walls. The lunch rush had finally started to slow down. Some customers had finished eating, and a few new ones were still coming in. The sound of laughter mixed with the gentle clinking of forks and glasses. Everything seemed normal until the restaurant door opened again, letting in a small gust of wind and the faint smell of rain. A man stepped inside quietly. His name was David, though no one there knew it yet. He looked around the restaurant with calm eyes, taking in every detail, the chandeliers, the elegant tables, the smiling guests. His expression was peaceful, almost proud, but also curious, like someone who had a deep connection with the place. David wasn't dressed like most of the other guests. He wore a plain blue shirt, slightly wrinkled from the day's work, and simple dark jeans. His shoes had a bit of dust on them, and his hands looked strong, hands that knew hard work. He carried himself with quiet confidence, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that comes from knowing who you are. As he walked toward the waiting area, a few people glanced at him. Some smiled politely. Others looked away. The hostess was busy seating another group of customers, so David stood patiently near the entrance. He didn't complain, didn't try to get attention, he just waited. Behind the counter, Mark, the same waiter from earlier, noticed him. Mark was wiping glasses and chatting with another waiter when his eyes landed on David. He frowned slightly. To him, David didn't look like someone who belonged in a fancy restaurant like this. His mind quickly made a judgment. Probably someone looking for directions or just curious, he thought. After a few minutes, David approached the counter with a gentle smile. "Good afternoon," he said in a calm voice. "I'd like a table for one, please." Mark forced a polite smile, though his tone carried a hint of superiority. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" David shook his head. "No, I was hoping to have lunch here today. I heard this place is one of the best in town." Mark gave a small, fake laugh. "Well, it is one of the best," he said, emphasizing the words as if to remind David that it might be too good for him. He looked down at the booking sheet, pretending to check. The truth was, there were still 2 empty tables near the window, but Mark didn't even consider offering one. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "We're completely booked for lunch. Maybe you could try the cafe across the street. They have good sandwiches." David looked at him, his expression still calm. "Oh, I see," he said softly. "Thank you." He paused for a moment, glancing around the restaurant again. His eyes lingered on the kitchen door, the staff moving about, the customers laughing. It was as if he was studying how everything worked, how the people behaved, how the service flowed. Mark grew slightly impatient. "Sir, if you'd like, I can call you a taxi," he offered, his voice polite but cold. David smiled again, a small knowing smile. "No, thank you. I can find my way." He nodded once more, then quietly turned toward the door. As he walked out, a young waitress named Sarah noticed the exchange. She had seen the look on Mark's face, and it made her uncomfortable. When David stepped outside, she leaned closer to Mark and whispered, "Why didn't you just seat him?" "We have open tables," Mark shrugged. "Come on, Sarah, you can tell he doesn't belong here." "Probably couldn't afford it." "Let's focus on real customers," Sarah frowned. "You don't know that," she said softly. But Mark ignored her and went back to serving another table. Outside, David stood for a moment near the restaurant's front window. Through the glass, he could see the people eating, the waiters moving quickly, and the smile on Mark's face as he served others. A gentle breeze brushed past him, carrying the scent of roasted garlic and fresh herbs. He looked up at the restaurant's name on the sign above the door. For a brief second, his calm expression changed. There was sadness in his eyes, but also something stronger. He took a deep breath, adjusted his shirt, and walked away quietly. Inside, life went on as usual. No one thought twice about the man who had just left. But as Sarah watched him disappear down the street, something about him stayed in her mind. He didn't look angry or embarrassed. He looked thoughtful, like someone who had seen more than he let on. She turned back to her work, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't just any ordinary customer. A few hours later, the restaurant prepared for its evening shift. The atmosphere shifted. Candles were placed on tables, lights were dimmed, and the aroma of dinner dishes began to fill the air. Mark was in a good mood. The afternoon had gone well, and he even received a big tip from one of his regulars. As the staff gathered for their evening meeting, the manager, Mr. Lewis, announced that they would soon have a surprise visit from the restaurant's owner. The moment he said it, everyone straightened up. The owner rarely visited without notice, and whenever he did, it meant something important. Mark whispered to another waiter, "I hope he's in a good mood. Maybe he'll see how good I am with customers." The kitchen door opened and footsteps echoed through the restaurant. Every head turned toward the entrance. When the door finally swung open, silence filled the room. Standing there was the same man who had been turned away just a few hours earlier. His calm eyes swept across the staff, resting briefly on Mark. The manager smiled nervously and said, "Everyone, please welcome Mr. David Carter, the owner of this restaurant." Mark's smile vanished instantly. His face turned pale. The room went completely still. The man he had refused to serve earlier wasn't just a customer. He was the owner, and that was only the beginning of the lesson life was about to teach him. The next day, the restaurant buzzed with the usual morning energy. Waiters prepared the tables, chefs chopped vegetables, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. The sun streamed through the windows, giving the dining area a golden glow. Everything looked perfect, at least on the surface. But beneath that calm, a quiet storm was waiting to unfold. Mark walked in with his usual confident swagger. He believed he was one of the best employees in the restaurant. He had a habit of showing off, balancing multiple trays, joking with wealthy guests, and charming his way into big tips. But he also had a bad habit, judging people by their looks. In his mind, success and class were measured by clothes, watches, and shoes. As he adjusted his tie in the reflection of a glass door, he smirked. "Another busy day, another big tip," he whispered to himself. Around noon, customers started filling the restaurant. The chatter grew louder. Glasses clinked, cutlery sparkled, and laughter spread through the air. The restaurant looked like a painting of elegance, the kind of place people came to when they wanted to feel special. Mark moved from table to table, smiling widely, greeting regular customers like old friends. He was in his element. Then the door opened. A familiar figure stepped in. David. He wore the same simple clothes as before, a plain blue shirt, slightly faded jeans, and a gentle smile. He walked in calmly as if he belonged there. But this time his eyes carried a quiet purpose. Mark saw him immediately. His face tightened with annoyance. "Not again," he muttered under his breath. "Doesn't this guy understand this place isn't for everyone?" David walked up to the same waiting counter. He nodded politely at Mark. "Good afternoon," he said. "I was hoping to have lunch today. Do you have a table available?" Mark sighed and looked around. There were several open tables, but he pretended to check the booking sheet again. "Sir, as I told you yesterday, we're fully booked for lunch," he said in a rehearsed, polite tone. David smiled patiently. "I see a few empty tables by the window," he said softly. "I don't mind sitting there, even if service takes a while." Mark's smile grew thinner. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. "Those tables are reserved for our regular guests. You understand, right?" His tone carried a hidden insult, a small sting behind every polite word. David looked at him for a moment as if studying him. "I understand," he said quietly. "But may I ask, do you really believe I shouldn't eat here?" Mark's mask of politeness cracked slightly. "It's not that, sir," he said quickly, his voice sharper now. "It's just, this is a high-end place. We try to keep a certain standard, you know? It's about the kind of clientele we have." There was a heavy silence. The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. Sarah, the young waitress from before, overheard the conversation from a few feet away. Her heart tightened. She wanted to say something, but she hesitated. Mark was senior to her, and she didn't want to cause trouble. David gave a small, sad smile. "Ah, I see," he said softly. "So it's not about the food then. It's about how someone looks." Mark stiffened, realizing how bad that sounded. No, that's not what I meant," he said quickly. "I'm just saying people expect a certain atmosphere here. Maybe a more professional look." David nodded slowly, not angry, not defensive, just calm. "Thank you for explaining," he said. "You've been very clear." He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the room once more. Some customers had begun to notice what was happening. A few looked away, pretending not to hear. Others whispered quietly, their curiosity piqued. Mark crossed his arms, feeling victorious. In his mind, he had handled the situation. He even thought he had done the restaurant a favor. "We have an image to protect," he told himself. As David reached the door, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. His eyes met Mark's, and for a brief moment Mark felt a strange uneasiness. There was something in that gaze. Calm, powerful, but deeply disappointed. "Thank you for your honesty," David said simply. "Have a good day." He walked out quietly, closing the door behind him. The soft chime of the bell above the door echoed in the silence that followed. Sarah exhaled slowly, shaking her head. She approached Mark. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly. Mark rolled his eyes. "Sarah, please. This is business, not charity." But he was polite, she insisted. "He didn't do anything wrong." "You just assumed," Mark snorted. "Look, you're new here. Trust me, people like that don't come here to eat. They come to take photos or look around." He probably couldn't even pay the bill. Sarah looked at him sadly. "You really don't know people as well as you think you do," she said before walking away. Mark shook his head and went back to work, pretending he wasn't bothered. But deep inside, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had made a mistake. Hours later, as the sun began to set, the restaurant quieted down again. The golden light faded into soft evening shadows. Mark finished serving his last table, proud of how smoothly his shift had gone. He didn't know that his pride and his prejudice had just written the first chapter of a story that would humble him for life. The man he refused to serve wasn't gone. He was coming back. And this time, the truth would walk through the door with him. When David stepped out of the restaurant that afternoon, the city air felt different. The laughter, the traffic, the footsteps of people passing by all seemed distant, as if the world had suddenly slowed down. He stopped for a moment across the street and looked back through the large glass windows. From there, he could see Mark moving between tables, smiling at guests, completely unaware that the man he had just turned away was still watching. David didn't feel anger. He didn't even feel surprised. He had seen moments like this before, moments when people judged without knowing the truth. What hurt wasn't the insult. It was the disappointment. He had built this restaurant to be a place of warmth and respect, where every person who walked through the door felt valued. Yet in his own restaurant, a waiter had just refused to serve him because of how he looked. He watched quietly as Mark served a table of businessmen, laughing at their jokes and pouring wine with extra care. The contrast was sharp, kindness for some, coldness for others. Through the glass, David noticed the young waitress, Sarah. She seemed uneasy, glancing often toward the door where he had just exited. Her face showed a mix of guilt and concern. At least someone noticed, he thought gently. Instead of leaving, David walked slowly down the sidewalk and circled around to the back entrance. The alley smelled of food, smoke, and rain-soaked concrete. He passed by the delivery truck and greeted the kitchen staff unloading vegetables. They didn't recognize him in his casual clothes, but they smiled back politely. David peeked into the kitchen. The chefs were focused, shouting orders, moving like clockwork. He loved that energy. For a moment, he just stood there, watching the place he had built with his own hands years ago. He remembered the early days, how he had saved money from his first small cafe, how he had faced rejection after rejection before finally opening this fine dining restaurant. He had wanted it to be more than a business. He wanted it to be a symbol, that anyone, no matter their background, could create something beautiful if given a chance. And now here he was, standing unnoticed in the shadows of his own dream, turned away by one of his own employees. He smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "Sometimes life gives you lessons through people who think they're teaching you one." After observing quietly for a few minutes, David decided to walk inside again, but not as the owner. He wanted to see more, to understand how his staff truly behaved when they thought no one important was watching. So he found a quiet corner near the staff break area and sat on a wooden bench pretending to wait for someone. He could hear conversations through the open kitchen door. Mark's voice carried clearly above the rest. "I'm telling you, the guy didn't belong here. You should have seen his clothes. Probably thought this was some cheap diner." Laughter followed. "People like that ruin the vibe of this place," and he continued proudly. David listened, expressionless. Every word confirmed what he already knew. Mark had forgotten the restaurant's values. He had let arrogance replace kindness. Then he heard Sarah's voice, softer, unsure, but firm. "Mark, that's not right," she said. "You don't know his story. What if he was just having a bad day, or what if he really just wanted a good meal?" Mark scoffed. "Oh, come on, Sarah, you're too naive. This is fine dining, not a charity event. We need people who fit the image." David closed his eyes for a moment. He had once believed the same. That image mattered. But years of struggle had taught him that real class came from how you treated others, not how you looked. After a while, David quietly stood up and left the back area. He took one last look at the restaurant from the outside. The glow of the lights, the hum of conversation, it all looked perfect on the surface. But he now knew that something deeper was broken. He walked to the parking lot, unlocked his car, and sat for a long time with the engine off. The city buzzed around him, but inside the car there was silence. He thought of his late father, who had always told him, "Son, respect isn't something you demand, it's something you give first." That memory filled him with warmth and purpose. He reached into his pocket and took out his phone. He typed a short message to his general manager. "Hold a full staff meeting tomorrow evening. I'll be joining without announcement. Tell no one I'll be there." He put the phone away and looked once more at the shining restaurant sign across the street. The name gleamed proudly in gold letters, Carter's Fine Dining. His name, his dream. A small smile curved on his lips. "Let's see who truly understands what that name stands for," he whispered. Then he drove away, leaving behind the glowing restaurant and the people inside who had no idea that tomorrow would change everything. Inside the restaurant, Mark laughed loudly at a customer's joke, completely unaware that the man he had judged had seen everything. Sarah, however, couldn't shake off the unease in her heart. Something told her that the story wasn't over, that the quiet man who had left so calmly would return. And when he did, nothing in that restaurant would ever be the same again. The next evening arrived quietly, but the air inside Carter's Fine Dining felt tense. The chandeliers sparkled, the silverware gleamed, and the soft music played as usual. But something in the atmosphere was different. The staff didn't know it yet, but their world was about to turn upside down. The restaurant had opened for dinner just 30 minutes ago. Guests were beginning to fill the tables, families celebrating birthdays, couples on romantic dates, and businessmen discussing deals over wine. Everything seemed normal. But in the back of the restaurant, the manager, Mr. Lewis, stood nervously near the office door. He had received a message from the owner earlier that day. "I'll be visiting tonight. Don't inform the staff." Those words had been echoing in his mind ever since. Mark, as usual, was busy serving one of the VIP tables, his charming smile shining as he poured wine and cracked light jokes. He didn't notice the manager constantly glancing toward the door. He didn't care. His focus was on impressing the customers and showing off his so-called professionalism. At exactly 7 p.m., the door opened. The sound of it was gentle, yet it silenced something in the air. David walked in. He wore the same kind of outfit as before, simple, elegant, but clean and neat. This time, though, there was a calm power in the way he walked. His posture was straight, his eyes steady, and his quiet smile carried authority. The hostess at the front desk froze. She remembered him from the day before. Her eyes widened slightly as recognition hit her, but before she could say a word, the manager stepped forward quickly. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," Mr. Lewis greeted respectfully, lowering his voice. The staff nearby turned their heads. Some dropped their pens, others exchanged surprised glances. The name Carter rang like a bell across the restaurant. "Mr. Carter?" one of the waiters whispered. "As in the David Carter?" Mark's hand froze mid-pour. The bottle of red wine almost slipped from his grip. His heart thudded in his chest. He slowly turned toward the entrance. And when his eyes met David's, the world seemed to stop. The man he had refused to serve, the man he had looked down on, the man he had judged so easily, was standing there being greeted as the owner of the restaurant. David smiled kindly, looking around at the stunned faces. "Good evening, everyone," he said warmly, his tone calm but commanding respect. "Please don't stop your work. I'm just here to observe and talk for a while." The restaurant fell into an uneasy silence. Waiters tried to act normal, but their movements were stiff. Mark stood frozen by his table, his face pale. David walked slowly through the restaurant, his shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. He looked at every detail, the tables, the guests, the staff. His expression wasn't angry. It was thoughtful, disappointed, but still kind. When he reached the center of the room, he turned to the manager. "Mr. Lewis," he said, "I'd like to have a short meeting with the staff after the dinner rush. Make sure everyone attends." "Yes, sir," the manager replied quickly, almost trembling. David nodded and continued walking. As he passed Mark, he stopped. The sound of the room faded. For a moment, it was just the two of them. Mark's mouth went dry. "Sir, David raised a hand gently. "Not now," he said softly, his eyes steady. "We'll talk after the customers have gone." That single sentence felt heavier than any shout could have been. Mark lowered his head. His pride, his confidence, his arrogance, and all vanished in an instant. The rest of the evening moved painfully slow for the staff. Everyone worked quietly, trying to avoid mistakes. Sarah kept glancing at Mark, who now looked like a man carrying a mountain on his shoulders. He barely spoke a word. His hands shook slightly as he served dishes, and his once proud smile had disappeared completely. When the last customer finally left, the restaurant felt hollow. Chairs were empty, lights dimmed, and the air was thick with tension. The staff gathered near the front, standing in a nervous line. David stood in front of them, his calm presence filling the room. He looked at each of them slowly before speaking. "I started this restaurant years ago," he began softly, "with a dream that everyone who walked through these doors would be treated with dignity, no matter who they are. It didn't matter if they were rich, poor, old, or young. Respect was supposed to be the foundation of this place." The staff stood silently. Some looked at the floor, others nodded slowly. David continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But yesterday I came here as an ordinary man. I wasn't wearing a suit. I wasn't introduced as the owner. I was just a customer, and one of my own staff members refused to serve me." A painful silence followed. Everyone knew who he was talking about. Mark's throat tightened. He stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Sir, but I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't mean—" David stopped him gently. "Mark," he said calmly, "you didn't know who I was, but that's not the point. You shouldn't treat anyone differently based on who they are or what they wear. True service comes from the heart, not from judgment." Tears welled up in Mark's eyes. His voice broke. "You're right, sir. I was wrong. I judged him by his appearance. I feel ashamed." David looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you are sorry," he said. "But remember, mistakes like these don't just hurt others. They reveal who we are. The good news is who we are can still change." He then turned to the rest of the staff. "Let this be a lesson for all of us. Every person deserves kindness. The value of a person isn't written on their clothes or in their wallet. It's in their character." The room was silent, but every heart was loud with emotion. Sarah wiped her eyes quietly. Even the manager looked humbled. David gave a small smile. "Now let's rebuild this place, and not just as a restaurant, but as a place of respect." As he walked out of the restaurant, the staff stood in complete silence. Mark watched him go, his chest heavy but his soul lighter somehow. For the first time, he understood what true respect really meant. The night had ended, but the tension still hung in the air like a heavy fog. The restaurant was quiet now. No clinking glasses, no laughter, no chatter. Just the faint hum of the air conditioner and the low whisper of shame that filled every corner. The chandeliers, which once sparkled proudly, now seemed dimmer, as if even the lights were embarrassed. Mark stood behind the counter, staring down at his reflection in the polished wood. His heart felt heavy, his chest tight. The scene kept replaying in his mind. David walking in, the shock on everyone's faces, the moment he realized the man he'd refused to serve was the owner. It didn't feel real. He kept hearing David's calm voice. "True service comes from the heart, not from judgment." Those words hit him harder than any punishment ever could. Mr. Lewis, the manager, broke the silence. "Mark," he said quietly, "Mr. Carter wants to speak with you privately before he leaves." Mark swallowed hard. His palms were sweaty. "Now?" he asked weakly. "Yes," the manager nodded. "He's in his office." Mark nodded slowly and walked down the narrow hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached the door, he paused, staring at the golden plaque that read David Carter, owner. His stomach turned. He knocked gently. "Come in," David's voice called from inside. Mark opened the door slowly. The office was simple but elegant. Bookshelves lined the walls, a few framed photos hung neatly, and a soft lamp cast a warm glow. David sat behind the desk, calm as ever, his expression unreadable. "Please sit," David said, gesturing to the chair in front of him. Mark sat down slowly, his hands clasped together nervously. He could barely meet David's eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick. Then David leaned forward slightly. "Do you know why I didn't fire you immediately?" he asked. Mark hesitated. "Because you wanted to teach me something, sir." David nodded slightly. "Exactly. You see, firing someone is easy, but making them understand the weight of their actions, that's harder." He paused, his tone calm but firm. "Tell me, Mark, why did you refuse to serve me?" Mark's throat went dry. He took a shaky breath. "Sir, I thought you couldn't afford it. You didn't look like our usual customers. I assumed you were out of place." David nodded again. "You assumed," he repeated quietly. "And what made you assume that?" Mark lowered his head. "Because of how you looked. The clothes, the shoes, everything." David leaned back in his chair, his eyes gentle but sharp. "Do you think people like me, people who own businesses, build companies, and create opportunities, always look rich?" Mark didn't answer. David continued softly. "When I started my first cafe, I wore the same pair of shoes for 3 years. I cleaned tables myself because I couldn't afford staff. If someone had judged me back then like you did yesterday, maybe I would have given up." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. "I'm sorry, sir," he whispered. "I really am. I wasn't thinking. I just wanted to look professional." "Professionalism," David said, his voice steady, "doesn't mean looking down on others. It means lifting people up, making them feel respected no matter who they are. When a person walks into this restaurant, we don't just serve food. We serve dignity." Mark looked up slowly, eyes red. "You're right, sir. I was arrogant. I thought appearances mattered more than attitude. I thought I was protecting the restaurant's image, but really, I was damaging its soul." David gave a faint approving nod. "That's a wise realization. I'm not here to destroy your career, Mark. I'm here to help you rebuild your character." Mark blinked in surprise. "You're not firing me?" David smiled slightly. "No, but you will take a break. A few weeks off and unpaid. I want you to visit our local charity kitchen, spend time there, serve food to people who can't afford it. Look into their eyes. Listen to their stories. Then come back and tell me what you learned." Mark's eyes widened. "You want me to work at a charity kitchen?" "Yes," David said firmly. "Because humility isn't learned through punishment. It's learned through compassion." For a moment, Mark sat in silence, trying to hold back tears. He nodded slowly. "Thank you, sir. I'll do it. I promise I'll change." David stood and extended his hand. Mark hesitated, then stood up and shook it. It was a firm, sincere handshake, one that carried forgiveness, not authority. "I believe you will," David said softly. "We all make mistakes. What matters is whether we grow from them." Mark finally smiled weakly. "I won't waste this chance, sir." David smiled back. "Good. Then make sure that when you return, you treat every customer like they own the place, because in a way they do. Without them, we wouldn't exist." Mark nodded again, this time with conviction. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Mr. Carter," he said softly, "thank you for not treating me the way I treated you." David looked up from his desk, his eyes kind. "That's what makes the difference, Mark," he said. "Kindness, even when it's not deserved." Mark left the office quietly. Outside, the restaurant was empty, the tables cleaned, the lights dimmed. He walked through the space slowly, touching the back of each chair as if seeing it for the first time. Every table told a story. Every seat held a person he might have once judged. He walked out into the cool night air, feeling something heavy lift from his chest. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel proud. He felt grateful, and deep inside, he knew this was the start of a very different chapter in his life. The next morning, the city woke up to golden sunlight spilling across the streets, but inside Mark's heart, there was only the quiet sound of reflection. He hadn't slept much the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, David's words echoed in his mind. Professionalism doesn't mean looking down on others. It means lifting people up. He sat on the edge of his bed staring at the crumpled shirt he had worn yesterday. It still carried the faint scent of the restaurant, the scent of pride, judgment, and regret. For the first time, he didn't feel proud of the uniform that had once made him feel important. He felt small. But in that smallness, he began to understand humility. He got up, changed into simple clothes, and headed toward the local charity kitchen David had mentioned. It was a small building tucked between a church and an old bakery. The sign above the door read, Helping Hands Community Kitchen. When he entered, the smell of soup and fresh bread filled the air. Volunteers bustled around, chopping vegetables, stirring pots, and laughing together. There was no fancy music, no fine glassware, no expensive decor, just kindness in its purest form. A woman in her 50s, wearing a faded apron and a bright smile, walked up to him. "You must be the new helper," she said cheerfully. "I'm Mrs. Parker. Grab an apron, sweetheart, and we've got mouths to feed." Mark nodded shyly and put on an apron. It felt strange at first. No uniform, no polished shoes, no customers to impress. Just people to help. He started by washing dishes. His hands got soaked, his shirt got stained, and his back began to ache. Yet for some reason he didn't mind. There was something peaceful about it, something real. As the day went on, he helped serve meals to people who came in. Men, women, children, all with stories written on their tired faces. Some smiled gratefully, others avoided eye contact, embarrassed to be there. But every single one of them said thank you. One man in a worn-out jacket looked at Mark and said softly, "You don't know how much this means, son. It's been 2 days since I had a warm meal." Mark froze. He forced a smile, but inside something broke open. This man, who had nothing, still spoke with such kindness and dignity. It reminded him of David, calm, polite, humble. Later, during lunch break, Mark sat outside on the steps with Mrs. Parker. She sipped tea from a chipped mug and looked at him kindly. "You've got that look," she said with a chuckle. "The look of someone learning the world isn't what he thought it was." Mark smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I used to think success meant serving rich people in fancy places, but here, I think I'm learning what real service means." Mrs. Parker nodded. "Honey, everyone wears a story you can't see. The moment you stop judging what's on the outside, you start seeing what truly matters." Those words sank deep into his heart. For the next few weeks, Mark worked at the kitchen every day. He served meals, swept floors, helped kids with their plates, and learned to listen, really listen, to people's stories. He stopped seeing customers and started seeing humans. One rainy afternoon, a small boy approached him shyly with a bowl of soup. "Sir," the boy said, "thank you for giving my mom food." She smiles again now. Mark felt tears sting his eyes. He patted the boy's head gently. "You're welcome, little man." That night, as he walked home under his umbrella, he felt different. The rain fell softly on the pavement, but for once it didn't bother him. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Carter." When his 3 weeks at the charity kitchen ended, Mark returned to the restaurant. He stood outside for a moment, staring at the shining golden letters, Carter's Fine Dining. The same place, but he wasn't the same man. Inside, the staff was already busy preparing for the evening rush. Sarah noticed him first and gasped. "Mark, you're back!" He smiled humbly. "Yeah," he said. "Back and better, I hope." She tilted her head. "You look different. Peaceful. Maybe I finally learned what real respect means," he said softly. Just then, David entered the dining area. When he saw Mark, he smiled warmly. "Welcome back," he said. "How was your time away?" Mark took a deep breath. "Life-changing," he said honestly. "I saw people who had nothing, yet they were grateful for everything. I realized how blind I was, sir. I don't want to be that man again." David nodded approvingly. "Then you've learned the real lesson," he said. "It's not about punishment, it's about perspective. Remember this. A heart full of pride can't serve others, but a heart full of compassion can change lives." Mark smiled, eyes glistening. "Thank you for not giving up on me, sir." David patted his shoulder. "People grow when they're given the chance. I only did what someone once did for me." That night, when Mark served his first customer again, he didn't see their clothes or jewelry. He looked them in the eye, smiled sincerely, and said, "Welcome. I'm truly glad you're here. The customer smiled back, and in that simple exchange, Mark felt something powerful. Respect, connection, humanity. For the first time, he wasn't just a waiter. He was a man who understood the meaning of dignity, both giving it and receiving it.